and thank you very much for joining this webinar. So my name's Ali Brown. I'm the FASD Project Manager for FASD Hub Scotland. So I'm just going to introduce you to all of the panel and everyone that we've got here this evening, and then Sarah Brown will be giving us a short presentation about FASD. I'll then hand over to Professor Moira Plant, who is our chair this evening, and she will hold the discussion. Just to let you know, if you've joined one of our webinars previously, unlike others, we won't be taking any questions and answers this evening. Everybody had the opportunity to do that before this evening when you booked into the ticket. So thank you very much for everybody that did give us a question. We've taken all of those and we've themed them together, and that's how the discussion is going to be structured. So I'll just introduce everybody on the panel. So first of all, we've got Professor Moira Plant. As I say, she's going to be the chair this evening, and Moira lives in Scotland. We then also, starting at my left anyway, have Bethan McMinn, and she is from South Wales and a paediatrician down there. To my right, we've got Miranda, who is an educational psychologist based in Edinburgh. Below me, I have Sarah Brown, who is a paediatrician based in Scotland, and to her left we've got Jennifer Shields, who's a clinical psychologist also based in Scotland. And in the bottom row we've got David Gerry, who is actually in Canada this evening and representing EndPAE. And right in the bottom below Sarah we've got Roisin, who is in Manchester, is that correct? Yes. And then in the very bottom, last but by no means least, we've got Raja Mukherjee, I'm sure many of you will know, who's based in Surrey. So that's our panel for this evening. We're really, really delighted to have them all here. And I just want to say a massive thank you very much for them all giving up a Wednesday evening. I'm going to hand over to Sarah now, who's going to give us a quick presentation. So if you give her a few minutes while she sorts out flipping between screens. And I'm sure this will be really interesting. Thank you.
So I was asked to give a 10-minute talk on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and those of you who know me well will know that I'll struggle to stick to 10 minutes, but I'm going to try very, very hard. I was presuming I was speaking to an audience tonight of people who have perhaps been to training or have heard talks on FASD before. So it really is just an overview. So what is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? The wordy answer is it's a neurodevelopmental condition resulting from prenatal alcohol exposure. You can then develop some difficulties with learning, development, and I always find it difficult to say difficulties with behaviour, because often it's actually not the child's behaviour, it's how their behaviour is being interpreted that is the issue rather than their behaviour itself. There's some physical findings in the minority, and we're not going to spend too much time on that because the majority don't have any physical findings, and it is really the brain-based difficulties that are causing them to maybe require some additional support within school or home. But some children who have prenatal alcohol exposure do have some specific facial features. They can be small for their age and also have a comparatively small head size compared to another child of the same age. But overall, the majority of children don't have any physical findings. They have patchy profiles, where patchy profiles is really a description to say they don't necessarily meet criteria for a learning disability. Only about a third of children would have the criteria for learning disability, but they can have really quite significant academic difficulties, social difficulties, without any of the external clues that people often look for when they're thinking about alcohol-related diagnosis, such as fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. I've put the SIGN guideline there simply because I know one of the questions was regarding guidelines for diagnosis, and this was the first UK guideline. It's based very much on the Canadian guidelines, and for those of you who are perhaps professionals, that would be a useful link for you. So very briefly, only about 10% of children have facial features, and they're described as short palpable fissures, which is kind of smaller eye openings. The philtrum is the bit between your nose and your top lip, and that can be smooth. It doesn't need to be completely smooth, it's just indistinct sometimes. And then this thin upper lip, but again, I think that's quite an extreme example. It's almost no upper lip, so it can just be a thinning of the upper lip. But the main point is that 90% will not have facial features. And really that's down to timing of when alcohol exposure has taken place during the pregnancy. In this slide, I don't know if I can point, can you see my pointer there? So between kind of weeks 6 to 8 is when the facial features tend to form. And if you've got alcohol exposure at that time, you may have those facial features. But you can see that actually, people speak about babies developing, you know, in utero in the first trimester, it's all the organs, and then after that, there's all the brain wiring after that. And when you think about brain wiring, the brain keeps wiring until you're in your mid-20s. So to think that alcohol doesn't have an effect in those latter, you know, second and third trimesters for a redeveloping brain, you know, is obviously doesn't make that much sense. This slide I always like, but I don't like presenting it when there's kind of neuropsychologists on the audience. But my simple take on this is that alcohol affects how brain cells grow. So if brain cells, you can see in the top black and white kind of speckly slide, neurons, so kind of the brain cells start here, and then they've got to move out to the edges to make their connections. And in the one below, you can see where there's been alcohol exposure, the wee white dots haven't made it all the way out to the edges. And I suppose the way that I sometimes think about that is in the top one where there's no alcohol exposure, it's like they're forming really strong roads. So I say, I'm in Scotland, so I say the M8 because that's our major motorway between Edinburgh and Glasgow. And that's a kind of an information superhighway. Whereas if you've got alcohol exposed brain cells, it doesn't mean that the information can't get from A to B, but it might be in B roads or A roads or roads that just aren't so fast and aren't so quick to use. So it's about giving young people time to process information. I think that's sometimes one of the things that is kind of overlooked. There's also the statement there that of all the substances of abuse, cocaine, heroin, marijuana, alcohol has this more global effect. And I think one of the things we're seeing in addition to that is the synthetic cannabinoids look like they're having an additional kind of detrimental effect on brain development. So I think that's something that we'll be looking at, you know, in the coming years. But alcohol, depending on what time the brain is exposed to in pregnancy, it can cause a wide variety of difficulties. So prenatal alcohol exposure, how does it affect the brain? It kind of affects the brain wiring. So if you think about, people speak about white matter, myelination, and that's just really the insulation that goes along kind of electrical cables that keeps the signal in and keeps it moving fast. And often, if you're needing more time to think of an answer or to process information or to do mental maths in a classroom, you might just not fit in with the rest of the group in terms of the time scale that you've been asked to answer questions. And of course that can then erode children's confidence, young people's, you know, self-esteem. And it's that understanding that it can take a lot longer to lay down information. It doesn't mean that you can't lay down information. It just means that it requires a lot of patience, different techniques, and also different expectations that might not be necessarily based on an individual's age, but more about their ability. And it might be their ability that day rather than the day before, because we know that there's kind of day-to-day variation in what children can manage. The other thing that I think catches a lot of people out, particularly, well, I would say professionals as well, is that young people can often be quite good with their use of language on the surface. So they are able to read and write and chat, and that can mask all manner of difficulties they might be having, but it's difficult for that to be seen as the underlying cause for sometimes maybe why they're finding things a bit more difficult. So these slides I've kind of had permission to use, and in a very, very simple way, I just like that they show that children and young people with FASD brains are working really hard. And they're working really hard because they have less connections. You can see in that more colourful slide, in the control, there's lots of connections from the hemispheres going backwards and forwards. But if you've been alcohol exposed, yes, there's connections, but they're fewer. And on the black background slides, that is kind of functional MRI imaging where you're trying to do a task. So for children and young people who have not had any alcohol exposure, they use a little bit of their brain to do the task. if you have had more alcohol exposure, you light up more and more parts of your brain in order to try and do the same task. And if you did sequential scans going down the way, what you'd find is that the young people who have not had alcohol exposure, they can pick things up much quicker, whereas the same amount of brain would light up again and again and again. And it's a bit like, you know, when you're driving a car and you learn to drive and it's all very difficult to start with, and then it becomes quite automated. It takes much, much longer for that level of learning to be embedded so that it's easily accessible for the young person. So it's that over learning that is really important. There's lots of things that affect whether or not alcohol will result in effects for a young person. And just because there's been prenatal alcohol exposure does not mean a young person has FASD. And there's lots of things that mitigate the effects of alcohol, and that can be nutrition, age, metabolism, genetic makeup. And I suppose it's just, that's why we have the no alcohol, no risk message, is because we don't know who it's safe for. In some individuals, not safe, sorry, that's the wrong word to use, we don't know who'll be able to drink and not have an affected child. And that's why we have the no alcohol, no risk message, because that's the safest message for everybody who wants to have a healthy pregnancy. When we think about doing the diagnosis, we're looking at different brain domains, and this might be familiar to some of you. And when you look at the sign guideline, or when there's an assessment being carried out for FASD, or even when you're just trying to work out how best to help the young person in front of you, whether they've got a diagnosis or not, it's good to kind of think about these areas and think about what age is that young person functioning at. It might not be the same as their chronological age, and actually if you can adapt the way that you are tailoring interventions or thinking about how you're supporting them day to day, then I think it's an important way to kind of try and break down what skills they have and what areas might need a bit more support. The next picture is probably quite well used now, but it just shows that if you only look at expressive language, reading ability and actual age, you might find somebody who looks very able, but if you dig a bit deeper and look about how they manage relationships, how they manage time and money, their social comprehension and kind of maturity, they can be an incredibly vulnerable person. And the more able areas are kind of masking the underlying difficulties. And as you get older, it's harder to see this as a developmental root cause, as often the other difficulties in the young person's life kind of mask those basic neurodevelopmental difficulties. So I kind of debated putting this slide in because I think we're really trying to change the messaging around FASD, because we know that with the right diagnosis, with the right support, the right understanding, all the poor outcomes that are commonly associated with FASD, they're not inevitable. And I think this makes bleak reading. And I think if you are a parent of a young person who you think is alcohol exposed or has FASD, with or without a diagnosis, it's difficult to read these statistics. I always think they're kind of presented as well in a one-off, and actually it feels to me that it's much more sequential. If you've got a young person that's not understood in school and they struggle to attain in school, and they struggle to maybe keep up with their peer group, if they become a bit marginalised, you can see how that makes you at higher risk for poor mental health and subsequently maybe difficulties getting a job. And then the other difficulties that young people can experience kind of hang off those. You know, if you're somebody who has managed to get a stable job, be it whatever, you know, just something that gives you a bit of routine, that can be really a protective feature. So I'm hopeful that with better understanding and better recognition, that these statistics, you know, they're not inevitable. And I think the young people from Canada speak about, you know, origin stories. These don't have to be. This is not an inevitable consequence of having alcohol exposure antenatally. So for successful outcomes, early intervention diagnosis provide a crucial window for opportunity. It allows people to be educated about the condition, provide early intervention, link with resources, and can facilitate a successful transition to adulthood. We also know that protecting young children from any more kind of difficult aspects in their life, so trauma, abuse, changing home environments, these are difficult things for any young person to to manage. I think if you've got neurodevelopmental vulnerability, it's just an added difficulty. And we also know that younger diagnosis is protective. And although that slide says less than 6 years, I think that there is kind of evidence that, under the age of, kind of that primary school age is really optimal to try and get the right supports and the right understanding around a young person. So diagnosis alone doesn't improve outcomes. Diagnosis without the understanding that goes with the diagnosis, without understanding that young person within their home, within their educational setting, within their community, if we can tailor appropriate interventions and education, have a good understanding of a young person of what supports and goals they need, we know that we can get good outcomes for young people. I've put a few links there we've got a parent and carer guide, we've also done an educator's guide, and that's been in collaboration with staff in education in Ayrshire. And we've also got the Sign Parent Carer booklet. There's also the FASD Hub, who are kindly hosting tonight, and I'm aware that the audience comes from south of the border also, and so obviously there's other third sectors that are available. And obviously now that we're all online doing webinars and all sorts, all these resources are available to anybody, at the UK and beyond. So that's just some signposting.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I'm hoping that Moira is still there. Yes, she is. But you are on mute, so you'll need to unmute yourselves. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. So we're going to move on to the panel discussion, and I'm going to hand over to Moira, and I will just be hiding myself from this point forward. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ali. Thank you, Sarah. And that's really covered a number of the questions, certainly the initial questions on diagnosis. And I think your point is well taken, that a diagnosis can be reassuring for a parent and a carer in terms of them feeling that there is something there and something needs to be done about it. But unless there are other services in place, unless there's other information around, it's just a diagnosis. It doesn't go any further. And I think that's important, because we have to look at other ways of getting information out. And hopefully this will be a good example tonight. One of the questions is where you can get a diagnosis, and Sarah and Jen, both working with the FASD diagnostic scheme in Scotland, rolling out training for other paediatricians and psychologists. Raja, down in England, do you want to say anything at this point, Raja?
Yeah, I think in England it's slightly more complicated because the structure of services are very differently set up. You have clinical commissioning groups who are designed to work out what the diagnostic important areas are for each place, and then you've got places like Manchester who've got almost strategic health authority kind of level where they've got bigger funds to develop and sort of move things on. That doesn't exist everywhere, and the problem is that there is a lack of understanding, and so the commissioning intent isn't always there. Ours is a national service, so we did Scotland before Scotland set up, and now they're well ahead of us. But the nature of how things are set up is that we're an NHS-based service. Cassie runs the FASD centre in Ipswich, and then you have specialists with interest who do have sessions for this, but they're not doing this bespoke. The general approach is that you would be referred either to a paediatrician or to CAMS. If they have interest and knowledge, they should be able to see you and to start the process, but that's where it often falls down because the expertise isn't there to the right level and degree to have confidence to know both how to do it, what to look for, and then how to support, because Sarah's absolutely right. If you don't do the bits afterwards and you don't understand the needs of the person, you're not really going to be able to guide and support families. We published last week on something showing that families need more support. And that's crucial if we are going to make a difference and change things. But, NICE is hopefully going to come out soon, early next year, in terms of quality standards, building on the work done in Scotland, and that will then push CCGs, the clinical commissioning groups, to have to look and say, well, are we providing diagnosis? And if not, what are we going to do about it? And so hopefully things will start to change in the near future.
Thanks, Raja. One of the questions that came in about diagnosis was that has not been covered are what are the benefits of a diagnosis in an older child and a teen? And David, I wonder if you'd like to talk to that.
Sure, thank you. I'd start by observing we probably know the origin of diagnosis is from the Greek meaning gnosis, through knowledge. And even I was at one point given marching orders by our board to set up an adult clinic. And we saw 20 women. And it's remarkable to this day that probably 15 of the 20, when we, at the end of the day, gave them the findings, that they were jumping up and down, high-fiving, giving us hugs. They were excited. And apart from the field of FAS, how many medical diagnoses with such possibly severe outcomes are people going to be giving you such an enthusiastic and positive response? And the lesson I took from that was that it's a door opener through people, for people, because it's knowledge. And they realize that they have a problem, they're not the problem. And that's fundamentally life altering, because it gives them an ability to ask for help, to explain themselves to themselves. And it has made a huge difference to those women. And so at any point in life, a diagnosis is first and foremost, it's this knowledge that you take with you. Case in point, our daughter, I got her diagnosed when she was 9, and our son, the social worker, missed the boat, and he didn't get a diagnosis, so we squeezed him in at 18. And their trajectories, their life outcomes are radically different. Just getting the help and knowing. When she was little, we had to sort of get her to back off, but she would say to people, I'm not an FASD kid. You call me an FASD kid again, I'm gonna punch you. So we had to get her to back off the advocacy, but she's never been ashamed of it. And she just understands that that's part of who she is. And she's doing, all things considered, she's doing well. So the difference is, at any point you get a diagnosis, it's helpful. And you know, the sooner the diagnosis, the better. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And that answers a lot of the questions about diagnosis. Is it worth it? What's the point? Does it make a difference? And the answer, at whatever age, is an overwhelming yes. We have a number of questions on behaviours, on practical advice, and I've really just picked 1 or 2 of them. How can we support preschool children with FASD? How can we help a child with FASD? And a very specific one, how do we help children who have meltdowns? Who would like to start with that one? Just give me a wave. Don't all rush at once, of course. Sarah and then Raja.
So I can speak about the preschool children, because I suppose I see a lot of those in my clinic. And I think it's very different whether or not you've got a child who's coming with a diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder with sentinel facial features, which is, I suppose, how we used to think about fetal alcohol syndrome. So these are children that are much more easily and readily identifiable, you know, in infancy. But the vast majority are wee ones who come who have maybe just some concerns about development, but don't have any facial features. You might have an alcohol history, and those wee ones aren't going to get a diagnosis until they can have a much more robust neurocognitive assessment. So my approach is always to speak to the families about what supports are out there. Things like, we're really successful actually now about getting wee ones into early nursery placements. So in Scotland, we can get them in from the age of 2, and they're into, you know, really good local authority nurseries that link to the primary schools. And within that, you'll have speech and language champions. You've got connections with OTs, speech and language therapists, and I think that's a really good place to help support wee ones' development. And our nurseries work with families as well, and they can involve them in psychology parenting courses, etc. So that really would be my approach to the preschoolers who, without a diagnosis, they all need the same sort of structured environment. And that can also help paediatricians untangle what might be environmental contributions, what might be you know, a bit more amenable to intervention, and that can be quite useful from a diagnostic point of view as well.
Thank you. Raja?
Thanks. It works quite nicely because I obviously deal with the older kids and adults more so than the preschoolers. So the thing that's always struck me, I come from a learning disability background. We used to have a term called challenging behaviour. I've never liked it because the question you have to ask yourself is who's being challenged? Because it's us who are challenged because we don't know what's going on. And it comes back to that understanding that we talked about before. You have a situation with an individual who is being putting into situations we're asking them and demanding things of them that they sometimes struggle to do. Sarah's presentation showed quite nicely that they struggle to process information. They are put into situations where they have to work harder to do what other people are expected to do, and we do not make accommodations for their needs. So it is us who do not understand the needs of the individual. And if any of us, and I mean absolutely everybody, and there's 102 people attendees, if you push their buttons enough, you will melt and have a meltdown, because effectively we all can do it. And so what we're saying is that if we put people into a situation which they can't tolerate, they haven't got the ability, we developmentally expect too much of them. And that's not saying that they can't achieve. It is about saying our expectations need to understand and change. If you can understand that context and then say, okay, what I'm going to do is be different. And this is what we say about parenting. Parenting doesn't need to be better parenting. It needs to be different. You need to understand what to do in a way that actually allows you to accommodate to the needs of that individual, so you understand them, and then actually give them the space when they need it, or actually give them the encouragement when they need it. So you scaffold their difficulties and you encourage their abilities, and therefore you understand, actually, we can all have a meltdown. Let's not worry about it. Let's work out what to do, prevent the strategies you can prevent, and improve the strategies and react to them when you need to. And so it's putting it into that context. So the challenging behavior doesn't become a meltdown or challenging behavior because we understand what is happening, why, recognize it beforehand, and then can do something about it.
Thank you.
I'm stopping.
It's also reminding me of one of the things in one of Sarah's slides was about language skills and how sometimes these children and young people can appear to be understanding things very clearly, and you can explain something to them, ask them if they understand, and they'll say yes. They might even be able to repeat back to you what you've said to them, but that's actually different from understanding what you're saying. So there's a concrete thinking about it that does not allow the child to think more fully, and perhaps not as creatively as we would have when we're thinking about it. There's one of the questions has been about mental health needs of adopted children. What I'm going to do is take that aside and park it, but come back to it when we look at adoption. But I'd like to move on a bit to education, and I'm looking at Miranda here. There's some really interesting questions here on impact on education. How do we support children through schools? How do we advocate for children in schools? Perhaps, David, you could come in later and talk about how we advocate for children in schools, because that's something as a parent you would know. Miranda?
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. So I suppose it's always really important to think, we've talked about the child as an individual, but certainly it's the child interacting in their school environment. And I suppose in Scotland, you know, as an educational psychologist, I deal with children aged 3 to 18. So I think it's really important to have a very collaborative kind of assessment process. So involving parents and the young person themselves, and making sure that you're liaising with health as well is really important. So I suppose within the Scottish context, we do have a kind of legislative framework, and we've got a planning process. So that's the GERFEC process, and that's getting it right for every child. And I suppose in terms of supporting children, it's been really clear that we're identifying where they do have impairments, where they're having difficulties in their everyday life. And I suppose it's not just obviously confined to school, and that's the collaborative process that we need to understand what's going on in their community and at home. And I think in terms of supporting kids, it's kind of looking at their individual profile. And I suppose research kind of indicates we're really clear about their kind of academic skills being affected, in particular you know, kind of mathematical skills, literacy skills. And I think the more you can individualize in terms of their needs and what's happening kind of within the wider environment, in terms of, you know, what resources are available, what's the kind of staff, you know, supports, what adjustments can be made. I think that's how we tailor it as well in terms of supporting children. So it is a very individualized process that we do tend to look at when we're thinking about kids. And with that, I suppose sometimes we focus just on the learning, but obviously we need to look at the behavior. What's that communicating to us at the time? What is the child saying themselves? Their voice is central. You know, we're lots of professionals, people around the table, but have we actually included the pupil's voice in that? And I suppose just thinking about the wider participation, kind of, you know, the kind of, I suppose the kind of after school, the peers, because obviously if a child's unhappy in school, they're not going to learn as well as a happy child. So there are some aspects. I always think when we're advocating for, we have lots of different kind of FASD pathways in Scotland. From a professional point of view, when I'm advocating for FASD, I think it's really important to, I suppose, have, like we said, knowledge. Knowledge is key, understanding the sign guidelines, making sure that we're gathering information kind of across the board. It is a whole body disorder, making sure we're really clear of that profile as well. And supporting, I suppose, supporting and advocating parents if they're seeking that diagnosis. And just really kind of making sure we've got evidence and we're kind of supporting that for kind of health diagnostics as well.
Thank you. David, can we ask you how to support children? As a parent, how do you support a child in school? I'm always conscious of people thinking that the child's behaviour is often more difficult and more hyper on a Friday, when actually they're just getting tired because they've been at school all week. But as a parent, how do you see the school education and what's the best way of helping the child?
Well, I think the speakers have alluded to the fact that behavior may be a symptom, it's not willful, and so on and so forth. And that's perception, and that's why I really like the neurodevelopmental. There's too much baggage, prenatal alcohol exposed with FAS. First thing I would say to parents is it's really important. We call them the 20,000 euro meetings. When you go to a meeting at school, often something has gone pear-shaped, and there's a whole bunch of district officers and so on. There's one, maybe two of you, to make sure you go with somebody to take notes, because a lot of things can go by, you get agitated, you're upset, and you need somebody to be calm. Earlier you had Maria Ketterick on, and one of the parents was saying she didn't feel capable of doing, gave her a lanyard. And when they went into the meeting at staff room at the school, people thought, oh, she's got a badge, she must be important. And they were asking her questions about this other woman's child. And she said, no, why didn't you ask her? So another point I would make is it's hard to go into those kinds of meetings, especially if something has gone wrong, and the tone of the meeting, but lighten it up. Think of yourself as a parent advocate as you've got a PhD from the School of Hard Knocks. So all the other people have a lot of initials after their name, but you have a lifelong trajectory, and probably they're not going to be moving out of their home. You know, when they get to be teenagers, you got to buckle the seatbelt really tight because it's a wild ride. And education is just one of the many steps, and you need a community around you. So certainly in Ireland, I would point out to our website to resources. There's lots of resources on the web, but you know, apart from our homes, kids spend the most amount of their growing up time in schools. And so that's why it's so important to work closely and collaboratively with the educators who are going to be there with you on that journey.
Thank you, David.
That helps.
Jen, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think there's been lots of really valid and excellent points raised, and one of the ones from Miranda that struck me, which echoed with David, was thinking about the behaviour, you know, before the learning part, when you're considering how to enhance learning. I think for us, it's about understanding the behaviour, which was usually saying, you know, the child was waving many a red flag to say, I cannot do this, or I can't cope with what you're expecting me to do, or I can't cope with what you're expecting me to do in this environment that hasn't been adapted for me. And I felt like many light bulbs went off in my head when I was listening to young people and adults who had FASD explaining what it was like to exist and be in a classroom. And just to look at the chat, somebody was speaking about mainstream classrooms and how do we cope with adjustments and all these different adaptations that need to be done for all these children. And what was striking for me was to hear about how the most simple adaptations, such as clearing the wall from the kaleidoscope of colourful drawings and pictures, and shifting the desk to a different part of the classroom where the teacher was maybe a bit more available, but also the noise wasn't so in their ears, and the light wasn't in their eyes, and just thinking about the whole sensory environment and deregulation to the point where you're able to learn. And I think then behaviour started to dissipate. And for us in the team, when we're doing the diagnostic work, and we talk about diagnosis, it's exactly as you said, David, it's about the knowledge and having that lens, that different brain lens over the child to understand what it is that they need, and doing that as early as possible. And I think that's where we can all work together to bring that knowledge from family, from the clinician side, from the education side, from whoever else is in the team around the child, just to get that understanding is key. Because I think there's nothing worse to feel like you're doing your best and you're just not managing to make the grade no matter what you do, and people then give you a hard time and all you've done is just exhaust yourself trying to fit the mould. And you know, it makes me really sympathetic to children who have went misunderstood for many years, and for families who have struggled to get that understanding. So I think that's why we're quite passionate for what we do just now. And I think these discussions are great to just keep everybody, you know, current and connected with each other. I could go on and on, but I'll try to stop myself now.
Thanks, Jen. I was reminded of talking with a parent who said that the best thing that happened to her child at school was she was moved to a desk at the front of the class. So when the teacher said to the class, open your books at page 23, she looked directly at the child and said, open your book at page 23. Because if she didn't do that, the child didn't think it had anything to do with her. And the misinterpretation that happened within the school system and in many other systems, because people just misinterpret the behaviour of the child as something often willful, when actually it's certainly not willful. And a lot of these children are at least as frustrated as everybody else is about the difficulties that they have. Thank you for that. Moving on a bit to support and adoption issues, and I'm opening the floor to anybody here, but and some of the questions are quite detailed, but things like current provision of support for young people with a diagnosis and their families depends to a large extent on where in the country you are, indeed in which country you are, given David's from Canada. But I'm wondering about adoption issues such as when a parent, when a prospective adoptive parent is asked, this child has had some prenatal alcohol exposure. What does that mean? How do parents come to terms with perhaps at times not getting the full amount of information that they need to make the decision, and then feeling their failures because this child is not developing normally, whatever normally is, and they feel as though the whole of this health service is against them because they're not the child is not behaving well. And I'm saying behaving well, taking into account, David, as you said, this isn't about the behaviour, it's about our interpretation of the behaviour. And it's often, as Raja said, about how we trigger that behaviour, which is not helpful. But any comments, and I'm looking at Ali, who's disappeared off my screen, but in terms of adoption issues, Ali, hello.
I'm here.
You would be one of the key people to answer some of these questions. What is the support for parents and carers? How do you move forward with it?
So I think there's a number of different levels of support for parents and carers. It's important to get your support network, whether that's your family, your friends. You know, your support network could be made up of professionals even. And I think it's important to remember that you're not going to get the support you need from one person, and everybody won't give you all the different types of support you need. So, you know, think about, is it an advocate? Think about, is it a listening ear? Think about, you know, is it somebody that can just take me out and talk about something other than my children? So your support network can look at lots of different things and can be many people. And then there's obviously online support where you can go and join groups, and you know, lots of organisations like ourselves and lots of the other third sector organisations have online peer support groups. So that's, you know, people who are living exactly what you are living. And I would say, you know, they are our groups, and many others are a combination of adoptive parents and foster carers, kinship carers, biological parents. So, you know, the thing that we all have in common is that our children are struggling with this prenatal alcohol exposure or having an actual diagnosis and all that that brings. So that's one other level of support. Sorry, I've got a terrible cough. And then there's obviously, you know, going and looking out for things like speech and language, OT, the more professional end of support. And some of those things as a parent, you know, you can actually access things like speech and language. You can usually, certainly in my local area in Scotland, you can make a self-referral into that. So you haven't always got to wait for another professional to open the door for you. But, you know, there will always be parenting groups as well that aren't necessarily about FASD, but they could be other neurodevelopmental, or, you know, quite often you can find quite a lot of support from little groups that are close to you, that of other parents with children that are neurodiverse. So I think there's many different things, and my experience personally would be that you probably find that you want a bit of all of those things, because there's periods of time when you just need to speak to people that totally and utterly get it. You haven't got to explain all the other stuff around it. But then there's other times when you're like, I just want to go out and speak to people who understand what it's like having a child that's maybe, as you said, not normal, but you know, has got some other additional challenges in life, but you don't need to explain all the other bits and pieces around it. Hope that helps.
It helps a great deal, thank you. And I think I like your bringing in the whole idea that parents and carers have to be acknowledged as having a life other than as a parent or carer.
Absolutely.
And that's really important. David, you look as though you want to say something. David, do you?
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head. Yes, you. The Chinese say, you know, it's better to give from a whole cup than a full cup than an empty one, and you get used to an empty one.
Yeah.
No, I was just laughing. Well put, Moira. Thank you.
And I guess the other thing is that, Sarah, are you waving or scratching your head, Sarah?
It was a bit of both. I was wondering if part of your question was what I think the information that has historically been given to prospective adoptive parents has been poor. I think that there has been big moves to try and improve that information. I do find it difficult to think, if we are making this diagnosis or we are bringing up the prenatal alcohol exposure, what does that mean for permanency planning for a young wee one? And I think that was one of the questions I think I saw on the list. And I know that Jen and I, over the years, have really kind of struggled with this in terms of, are we stopping a child finding a forever family because we are, you know, bringing attention to the fact that there's been prenatal alcohol exposure? And I think back to a conference that we did in Adoption UK, I think it was in 2018, might have been earlier, and it was that I just remember parents saying, if we knew, you would give us a fighting chance. And it's that, and those words I still remember the room, it still sticks in my head, but, you know, giving parents a fighting chance, that's what we want to be doing. But it's very difficult to know what impact we're having on the social care service and how social workers are able to respond to the concerns that are being raised. And I think that they're probably a missing voice in lots of the discussions we have around about the diagnosis and how we support social workers to be more aware that actually it should be a protective diagnosis, and it can prevent lots of the misunderstandings that lots of adoptive families then endure. And I'm seeing that Raja wants to comment, but I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that that's a huge, and Jen is leading because I'm boring her, but in general, our concerns about this area has led to Jen looking at social work perspectives and trying to build more links so that we can document what the hidden consequences is of us bringing this to the forefront in terms of young people and infants, and what the secondary consequences are in terms of finding placements. But yeah, Jen might want to pick up on that a bit.
Thank you. Raja first and then Jen.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it strikes me that the narrative of this whole subject is always negative. And the thing that struck me when I did my PhD over a decade ago now, when we collected the data, is one of the things that came out of it is families said that if you get these kids on their own, they're awesome. They're really great kids. You can have a really great time with them, but you have to understand the difficulties as well. But the narrative is always very negative. The thing that we have is the thing that came out of that as well was that carers said we weren't given information. We weren't told what to expect. So when we got something different to what we expected, we were upset. And so they want to go into it with their eyes open and make choices. There is an uncertainty as a baby and having exposure as to what the outcome is going to be, because it doesn't equate that prenatal alcohol exposure leads to negative outcomes. It can do for many, but it doesn't do for everybody. I think that's an important understanding that we have to have. And so you have to take that level of uncertain risk at that stage and say, well, actually, what am I going to do and how do I play it? It's already been said, there isn't enough support. It's already been said, and we actually published a paper on our PSI stuff showing that actually it's the child-related factors and not knowing what to do with the child that is more important in the dynamic between the child and parent than it is the parent-related factors in the overall stress of the situation. You know, we published on that just recently, but it hasn't changed over a decade. Alan, who was my PhD student now and a doctor, did something similar recently. You know, it showed that actually things haven't changed over the last decade. So whilst we need to move the narrative from it's all rubbish to actually you do things right, you put the support in, we can make things better for people, then you're going to get to a situation where people make informed decisions about adoption and taking on these kids rather than saying it's all bad. So we need, in my opinion, to have to change the narrative from it's all negative to what can we do to get good quality lives for these kids.
Thank you. Jen?
Yeah, I just completely echo Raja and what he's saying. I think that not speaking about FASD or the potential for FASD early on and having that identified and understood just means that that will come later down the line. And like, you know, the focus then is on what are all the difficulties rather than having had an understanding of the child's difficulties and strengths, because there always are strengths that can be harnessed. And instead of parents and carers and people feeling able to just really focus on that, harness those, nurture those, and try and work on difficulties, they're spending a lot of time and energy knocking on doors, trying to get professionals meeting, trying to get heard, trying to knit together diagnostic pathways for FASD because they don't exist. And one of the queries in the list there was about, is there a change in the NHS? I truly believe that there is. I think the environment that we're in just now in the NHS is light years from where it was 8 years ago when we started out. And I'll put my hands up, I didn't understand enough about FASD, didn't have any, you know, particular training in my clinical doctorate training course that is changing. We're going out and trying to train professional courses to then train on FASD. All of the work that we've all done collectively, and it's an international effort really, because we have borrowed from international partners to get the sign guideline, which we never had. We've got e-learning modules coming, which we didn't have. We've now got in the UK a network of people who are becoming more confident in this, and that's all cascading down into more knowledge and confidence for people. And I know it's slow, drip drip coming, but it is starting to change, and I am seeing a change in the tide. So I'm feeling more confident, and I think that we now need to help our social care and social workers understand these kids, and that it's not all doom and gloom, as you were saying, Raja, that these kids can do brilliant things, and we're getting to know children who have remarkable talents and strengths, who really know that that's their gig, and they concentrate on that, and these things are nurtured. And see, instead of having these kids bashing their head against a brick wall in terms of trying to do the things that their brain isn't wired to do, we find ways of compensating or adapting, or we say, do you know what, that isn't your gig, let's focus on what you enjoy and what you like to do. And you know, and that's where education partners can adapt the learning programs for children so that they engage and they feel like they're doing well. And just to comment on the mental health side of things, that's when kids start to feel like they're able, I've got something to offer, I'm good at this, and I can be confident. And we see that in the young people that we meet who get understood and who have that lens with them. So yes, I'm full of hope and optimism, I have to say, and I think Raja's completely explained why, and I think the work that Miranda and people are doing across the country is tremendous to make improvements for these children and families. Again, coming off the soapbox, sorry.
Thanks, Jen. It always reminds me of the don't try harder, try different. Miranda, you wanted to say something?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, we're all singing from the same kind of hymn sheet here, but I suppose just I was picking up on what Ali was talking about, you know, in terms of having different support networks. And I think during my practice and in this area, I've become much more mindful of asking specifically, what do you need right now? What's going to make the difference at this point in time? You know, not the professional view of what's going to help, but actually making sure that I'm listening to the parent. And it might be just listening to their story, it might be facilitating, it might be signposting, it might be, you know, getting involved in the assessment process, and asking the young person as well as they mature, you know, what's your voice in this? What's going to help you directly, or what do you want staff to know about you? What do you think is going to help you that day-to-day, in your day-to-day life, and especially in the school context, where that for some young people that is their main social life as well. And we can forget, you know, so we need to kind of think about that. It's not just about the academics, it's about the social inclusion, you know, and their enjoyment of their world as well.
Thanks, Miranda. I'm aware that Roisin and Bethan haven't said anything yet, partly because I've not come to you, but more because I was hoping that people would wave if they wanted to come in. Is there anything that either of you would like to say at this point? Roisin, you have to unmute yourself.
We're very much a prevention programme here in Greater Manchester, and I suppose one of our priorities, I absolutely take on board all of the comments that have been made this afternoon, but one of our priorities in Greater Manchester is to try and educate women pre-pregnancy and in early age stages of pregnancy around the risks associated with alcohol. And a big part of that has actually been training midwives. The Alcohol Institute released some research last year with the University of Edinburgh and the University of Hull, and 48% of midwives did not know the up-to-date Chief Medical Officer's advice. So what we're hoping is that our programme will impact, and therefore people will make different choices based on accurate information. So families don't find themselves in the situation where all of the families that are on this webinar have found themselves.
Thanks, Roisin. Bethan?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for having me as well, actually, because I've learnt myself a lot from the discussions today. I'm a paediatrician in South Wales, and I've only just started as a consultant in November last year. So I've got a lot of experience in the diagnosis, assessment and management of children with other neurodevelopmental disorders like ASD and ADHD. But then as a team in our department, we've looked at the guidance that was published by Scotland last year and the draft guidance that was published, well is due to be published early next year. And we've already started to have some multidisciplinary discussions around how we're going to approach this, because we have become very aware of the fact that our historical approach, which was, you know, as a trainee paediatrician, my experience across South Wales was that either children received a diagnosis in the neonatal period when it was very obvious and there was a clear history of prenatal alcohol exposure, or then in a later presentation, if a child had some facial features, they were then generally referred to geneticists because we wanted to consider other genetic diagnoses. Now, these guidance that were published in Scotland, and obviously NICE as well, have made us aware of this large cohort of children that don't have those facial features. As Sarah was saying, 90% of these children affected by alcohol won't have those facial features, and actually they have the neurodevelopmental difficulties that we are accustomed and trained in assessing in other pathways such as ASD and ADHD, but we just don't have the pathway set up yet in Wales. Now that doesn't mean to say that we're not going to try. It's going to take time, because obviously we need to educate ourselves first and foremost. We need to understand a bit more, and this is the beginning of that, I suppose. Listening to you all and, you know, hearing all your experience, and I'm speaking with Raja tomorrow. So, you know, things are starting, but these things do take time and resources, and we've already predicted a couple of barriers we're going to come across, such as access to some of the assessments like cognition, memory, which usually needs an educational psychologist, which we can't access directly. So without those assessments, we can't make a diagnosis, and without a clear history of prenatal alcohol exposure, which is often hard to find as well, you know, our hands are tied as well. So, you know, we predict there's going to be difficulties, but we're definitely, you know, looking at this. And somebody asked in the chat, do we think the things are going to change? Well, I think it's quite clear from the guidance that, you know, we do have to change, because there's a lot of these children probably sitting in our caseload already that we need to support better, really.
Thanks, Bethan. We don't have a lot of time left. One of the questions was, when will NICE quality standards be ready? Probably early next year, from what we're hearing so far. Raja, are you waving, or are you just playing with your pencil? Oh, you're all waving.
No,
okay.
both. It was both. It was both. Okay. But I like playing with the pen as well.
Do you want to say something then?
Two things. First of all, NICE 21st of January is the due date for NICE next year. It's delayed currently because there's been lots of comments, and as some of you will have seen, there's been lots of debate around aspects of it, mainly around the recording of alcohol. And so there's a lot of work going around that. The thing that struck me, and it was following on for the lack of diagnosis, we've talked a little bit about mental health, but not really going as a psychiatrist on the panel. I think it's worth thinking about how we understand life, and this whole thing about trauma and how trauma is impactful on people, and that actually people can either externalize or internalize that behavior. And when people are internalizing their experiences, that's when you are starting to see the depressions, the wider traumatic things coming out, and you deal with that all the time, so you know about this. But one of the things that I like to talk about is those layers of trauma that tend to happen to people, and then what gets missed is the underlying neurodevelopmental condition underneath it. And we then add layers with a lack of diagnosis. We expect people, which is another layer of trauma, and then they get exposed to situations where they can't cope with, or they're abused and bullied, another layer of trauma. You have to peel back all of these different things to get back to the functioning underneath it, and that can be a challenge. And the diagnosis is a starting point, so it doesn't take away the balance between, so we get into a debate about should it be about a functional assessment or should it be about diagnosis. Well, you need both, and it's about understanding how the two relate together in order to move these kind of things forwards. And what we miss is the vulnerability that these kids have in terms of taking that forward. Unless we get that and manage that and support that, we create a situation where these things get worse and worse, and that's how we end up with all the secondary disabilities that everybody talks about. You change the narrative by identifying it, putting in place the factors so those layers don't get created. You don't create the layers, you don't have the PTSD, you don't have the traumatic experiences. You can actually prevent some of those negative outcomes. But what we do is we miss it. We create as professionals and society layers of difficulty for the individual, which they have to then work through. And that's the challenge. And so all of those kind of factors have to come into it. And it's one thing I want to get in before we finished.
And you did. Well done.
Thank you.
Ali said we could run over a little. Is that right, Ali?
Yep, that's absolutely fine, Moira, as long as everyone's happy with that.
Is that okay? David, quickly, and then Jen. You need to unmute. Yes, you're unmuted.
A positive note, in the early 90s, they recognized a problem in Alaska. They got a study done and they found for every $1 of profit the state made in tax, there was $35 in costs. That led to the establishment of about 12 diagnostic clinics. Today, there's 6 left. They have a population of 730,000. That's 1 clinic per 120,000. So there in Scotland, Glasgow at that ratio would be 14 clinics and Edinburgh would be 4. And you might think it's all pie in the sky because it costs a lot of money. What they did in Alaska was they put a 2% surtax on the sale of all alcohol. And when I asked Mr. Google this morning, he said it was 10.7 billion in the United Kingdom of taxes collected on the UK on the sale of alcohol. At 1% by my math, that's 170 million pounds. So that would buy a few more paper clips for the nonprofits here online, and a few more clinics and a few more support staff, right?
Definitely, it was definitely a good start.
It was driven, but there is money there. It's parent power, it was lawsuits, it was advocacy, it was a lot of things. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to come to Jen in a minute. What I'm going to do is say to you all, I've got one question I'd all like you to give me one sentence on, and is it, what can we do as an FAS community? What next? So you can think about that while Jen is telling us what she's wanting to say.
And I can make my answer to that go into this as well, because it was just following on from what Bethan was saying about an FASD assessment pathway, and it was just to say that in Wales as well as Scotland, I've heard presentations from Wales that people are looking at neurodevelopmental pathways, and I'm sure you would have heard all about this, about autism and ADHD and other neurodevelopmental queries being seen in the one pathway. And we've got an agreement in Scotland now in print that there'll be a neurodevelopmental service specification for all the health boards. So there'll be a neurodevelopmental pathway or clinic, if you like, happening all over the place. And so it's not going to be like a specialist FASD clinic dotted about here and there, and evolving this new FASD pathway. If kids who may be affected by alcohol in utero will be able to access the neurodevelopmental pathway, much like autistic kids or kids with ADHD, to have an assessment and diagnosis. And I think that is what we need to really build on, and build the expertise within that neurodevelopmental team to assess and diagnose and support children with FASD, because we would simply have to design too many clinics on their own, and that's just not possible. So that's what we're doing in Scotland. I'm hearing people doing that in England as well. I'm sure in Wales there's similar discussions perhaps, but FASD is definitely going to be in there for Scotland.
I totally agree, Jen, and that's the kind of discussions we've had on a department, that we envision this is going to be maybe as a part of our ND team. That's where it's likely going to sit, but we just need to think about what we have at the moment and what we can do right now and what we need to do in the future.
Thank you. And I think that one of the very important and very positive aspects of that would be that it can help with the stigma. This is simply another diagnosis, another series of assessments that are needed to be done in a regular clinic setting. Okay, what can we do as an FAS community? What next? One sentence from each of you. How about that? Let's start with Roisin, when she unmutes herself. Nope.
Webinars like this is a fabulous opportunity to get people together nationally without people having to commit to travelling, and it offers us an opportunity to find out what's happening across the country and how we can support each other.
Thanks, Roisin. Miranda?
I suppose I would advocate for kind of ongoing kind of collaborative practice between health and education, because I think we've more difficulties when we stay in our silos. So I think that collaboration is key.
Thank you. Raja?
You know, I said 20 years ago, I think this should be neurodevelopmental rather than sort of just FASD. But the one thing I would want to see changed is that we change the narrative for these people and these kids.
David?
We take a page out of the book of autism, where in the 50s autism was regarded as refrigerator mums, and today we see autism units in most schools, in many schools. So they've made significant change, and we hope for that change in our lifetime, so our kids have a future when we're gone.
Thank you. Sarah?
I think for me, it is establishing regular high quality training for multidisciplinary teams who are then supported to develop expertise and confidence. And I think what we have learned in Scotland is delivering training without those ongoing supports doesn't improve clinician confidence. And that is one of the things that we really need to focus on supporting, so that we're growing an army of people who are willing and confident and able to help the families, help the wee ones.
Bethan?
I'd just like to say thank you again, really, and I've learned some brilliant things this evening and taken some really good messages away with me, and I'm sure I'll be in touch with most of you again sometime soon.
Thank you. Jen, did you incorporate what you wanted into your last comments, or have you got something you want to say to finish?
Yeah, I just would really like, Sarah took the words out of my head about improving knowledge, but also confidence and attitudes. And I think people's attitudes to FASD assessment and diagnosis, there's a lot of barriers that I think we need to break through. And I feel like being truly a connected community is doing that training with families and people affected by FASD in all sorts of ways, and individuals who have FASD, because that is the only way I think we will be able to really foster confidence and improve attitudes about FASD, is really learning about the services we want to deliver from the people who are going to be accessing those services. So I really think that community, as Miranda says, needs to cross all those professional and personal barriers and come together to make these improvements, as we've seen in other neurodevelopmental conditions. And I think we can do it. I think this, you know, what you've done today, Ali, putting this webinar on and bringing these conversations out, and all the webinars that you do is tremendous, and the amount of knowledge that's going out there is fantastic. So yeah, I think we're on our way.
Thank you. I like that, to sound in a positive note. Bethan said she's learned a lot and it's been brilliant. I hope the participants and the people who've been listening in have found it useful too. Over to you, Ali. Can I just ask one thing, as apart from thanking you and your colleagues for putting this on? I think it has been very useful. I'd like to thank the panel for being very polite and making my job a pleasure this evening. My question, Ali, is one or two publications that Sarah spoke about, some of the publications Raja spoke about, is that something that could perhaps go on your website or something that people could find out about?
Yeah, so actually all of those things are already on the FASD Hub web pages. You can get the links to them from there already, but following tonight, everybody that booked up will receive an email and have all relevant information in, so we can include those links again for everybody. That's not a problem. Moira, thank you so much for chairing this evening. It's been absolutely brilliant. The conversation has been really provoking in many ways. It's been stimulating. It's good to hear from different professionals and their perspectives on where we're at with the journey of FASD. I think it's absolutely important that we celebrate the successes of everybody that has this condition, be that diagnosed or otherwise, which is part of what we've hoped to do during FASD month with our ICANN. So if you've not seen that on our YouTube channel or within social media, then please go and look at it. It's where young people have posted photographs and sent us pictures and images on themselves and their achievements, what they can do. You know, whether that's, for some people might look like a small thing, for others it looks like an amazing achievement, but they're all achievements and they're all successes. I'd really like to thank all of the panel. You've been so generous with your time this evening. You know, as a Wednesday night, most of us usually curled up on the sofa, I'm sure, doing something, not sat in our offices or spaces chatting to people online. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to all of those people that have signed in and stayed for the full hour and 13 minutes that we've now been here. So thank you very much, everybody. We are going to say goodnight. Thank you for the conversation there's been. We'll just take a few minutes to say goodbye. If I could just ask the panel not to leave straight away, and we'll just wait as people kind of drop off. Thank you very much. That is the end of the webinar.